Bill was talking about is inadequate, you know, it will not take much, and there are some low-hanging fruit that you really could make sure that these people are doing and get the right returns from this. Because how are we going to talk about NEACS AI 21 and what are the upcoming you know, problems when we are not even solving what we already have and the means to do?
So Pam, and you know, I'm taking a you know, probably putting my insurance hat back on for a moment, but the insurance industry, you know, we've all seen the articles in, you know, major publications where the insurance industry over the past year has gotten somewhat of a black eye by saying we were the kind of the perpetuating the ransomware by helping with the facilitation of the payment. To your point, I believe on a go-forward basis, we're actually going to be one of the drivers of change. Of course, there's governmental guidance that you're seeing government agencies need to have by certain dates, and I'm sure Alan can speak better to that than I can. But now you're starting to see from an insurance standpoint, if you don't have these certain, so I think from a, you know, I was looking at it, I was just looking at the document that you created 3 years ago. We may be a few years behind, but employee training is now that next wave of, I believe, controls that will be asked next year, right? Perhaps they couldn't do everything in 2021, but 2022, 2023, these things are going to start to become a subjectivity or demand rather than a nice to have.
Right.
Well, yes, thank you so much. You know, you're representing your insurance industry. So the question is really for a broader audience, but I appreciate your, and don't take it personally. So.
Of course, of course.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much. That was really lots of data, but very useful. Hopefully we take that back and raise the flags and go, hey, this is why we're doing what we're doing, because it's this other element of everything too. It's ensuring all this risk. So that's great. So thank you very much, Mark.
No worries. Have a great weekend, everyone.
Okay, you too. Okay, Alan, you are up. It is a time check. It's 2:11. So if we could target for 2:35 or 35 past the hour, depending on your time zone, I would appreciate it if we can make that work. And if not, keep us informed and we'll adjust.
I'll do my best. Thank you very much. By the way, I'm actually dealing professionally with all the issues that Mark just raised. The insight he provided was impressive. My name is Alan Citron. I'm a principal with the firm Risk Masters International. We're a small boutique consulting firm that advises businesses on exactly the things that Mark discussed: how to manage risk, plans, contingencies, testing, desktop scenarios, all those things. For those of you who are struggling to get cyber risk under control, I have another level to the problem. AI introduces a whole new level of risk and cyber risk. But hopefully I won't be scaring you. I'll empower you to deal with that. So let's talk about this. This presentation is derived from actually a full day class that we give to Osaka groups. So I've scaled it down. I'm going to go through it quickly. Feel free to contact me afterward by email or phone with any questions or comments. So first of all, if you're going to play in the AI space, you do need to have a basic understanding of it. You just can't go in and put in controls or audit if you don't understand the concepts that will challenge you. So let's take a quick look at what is AI. The best thing to look at, frankly, is the AlphaZero paradox. AlphaZero is a Go playing system built by Google. It didn't teach it how to do anything. It just taught it the rules. And they had two AlphaGo systems play each other for 24 hours. And after 24 hours of essentially trial and error and learning from trial and error, it became the world's best Go player. Rather remarkable. Now that's amazing. It's frightening. Actually, this past week, Henry Kissinger and Eric Smith have published articles in the Journal and the New York Times about the future of AI and how it will affect our social structure. And it's rather significant. But what is that? What do we learn from that? Well, actually, AI does not think the way a human being does. The fact that it statistically learned from trial and error is not how we think. What AI does is it enables machines to play roles in drawing conclusions from data and taking action. It learns from its experience, and this transfer of judgment from humans makes AI revolutionary. The bottom here is it actually does computational reasoning. When AI was invented, at the Dartmouth Conference in 1956, where the term was coined, computational reasoning was one of the terms they considered. It's just AI is more dramatic. But the problem is it misleads into understanding. So AI thinking is unconventional. It doesn't work the way our minds work, but it's also brittle. When it works, it can overturn centuries of pre-established methods and conclusions. The chess players and the Go players who saw AI were overwhelmed by its insights, far beyond what they thought humans can do, things that they thought were counterintuitive and counterproductive. And so it provides advantages, but it can also fail unexpectedly. If you look at the picture on the right, an AI system looked at this and said it's a man riding a horse down a street next to a building. That's very wrong. And the problem with AI is when it fails in ways you can't imagine. So in the way it can succeed in ways you can't imagine, it can fail in ways you can't imagine. And we're going to get into that. It's also crucial to understand that AI does not understand causation. It understands as correlation. And it may find things that correlate that we don't see. The graph on the right shows that someone plotted the number of Facebook users with the growth of Greek government debt. On a correlation basis, the growth of Facebook users would appear to have caused Greek government debt. Obviously, it did not, and that correlation changed over time. Facebook users continued to grow, Greek debt problem got resolved. That's a learning point about the data that you use in AI to develop your models. And you'll hear the term proxy data. Often the data that is used is not the data that you're actually studying, but data that relates to what you're studying. And also note, AI has often failed to meet expectations. Elon Musk has been promising fully self-driving cars in the next 2 years since 2015. And he is continuing to provide them, and they most recently pulled the plug on the latest release. When you deal with AI, keep in mind this comment he made after several years of failure: nothing has more degrees of freedom than reality. And you're going to see some examples of that challenge. And to give you an idea on failures that are not well known, you watch a football game and you see all these GM commercials for a partially self-driving car. What they don't tell you is that 67% of the time, these cars collided with broken down vehicles at 25 miles an hour, and that they actually disengage every 8 miles. And just this past summer, the NHTSA, National Highway Transportation Safety Authority, began an investigation into Tesla. 11 times since 2018, the vehicles struck driver assistance vehicles pulled over to the side of the road as emergency vehicles, fire trucks, ambulances, police cars. It didn't recognize them. So the key takeaways: AI systems do not think. They reason by processing vast amounts of data and identify data correlations, but not causality. These correlations can provide significant insights and capabilities, but AI thinking is brittle. When AI breaks, it breaks in ways human cannot foresee. Key points. As you get into trying to audit AI, you need to have some basic knowledge of the architecture. There's rule-based AI. Think of robots in factories. They're not learning how to move parts. People tell them how to move parts. There's machine learning, which is the umbrella of all the things that are so exciting today about data, looking at X-rays, looking at patterns, and then deep learning, which is a version of machine learning that is much easier to use. It has a lot more built-in capabilities, and so you can get a lot more out of it than you can with machine learning that requires more investment in mathematics and formula. Here's an example to help you understand the difference. Rule-based, how would an AI system call balls and strikes? Well, for those of you who know baseball, you know that a strike zone is a well-defined area. In rule-based AI, you build a system by defining the strike zone. You define the rules for balls and strikes. When you deploy it, your system observes the pitch and uses the rules to call balls and strikes. In a machine learning-based AI system, you would create videos of many, many, many millions of pitches, and you would listen to what the call was, ball or strike. You would probably want to adjust for umpire errors because the calls are not always accurate. And if you didn't adjust for umpire errors, your system would reproduce umpire errors. And you would then train the AI system based on that adjusted data set. When you deploy it, the system would observe the pitch in the same way, but rather than using rules to call balls and strikes, it would use its learning from having seen balls and strikes. These both coexist. If you look at a driving situation, stopping a vehicle, you'll see composite AI, rule-based plus machine learning. The car sees the stop sign, but that occurs from AI learning. It learns what a stop sign looks like. But all of the steps associated with then stopping the car are rules derived from the laws of physics, and they can be programmed. If we wanted to do that by machine learning, we would have to have cars crash millions of times until we learned what avoids a crash. And so when you are auditing AI systems, you need to understand what is rule-based and what is learning-based. If you get to the risks, it's actually simple. It doesn't always work, and it may work in unexpected and undesirable ways. That key thing about unexpected and undesirable, you may have a system that you think is successful and fails because it's doing things you don't expect. So let's learn from some well-known failures. A few years ago, Microsoft released a chatbot to engage people in verbal conversations over the internet. Within hours, it turned into a anti-feminist, pro-Hitler chatbot. What happened is people started tweeting crude, racist, and inappropriate data at the bot. It learned from that conversation and began using the language itself. Google, or actually Burger King, they had a commercial that they thought would be cute. The person is selling burgers, leans over and says, "Hey, Google, what's in a Whopper?" Thinking that it would trigger the response of people's home devices. Shortly after, the answer came back: chocolate candy, rats, medium-sized child, toenail clippings, and cyanide. Viewers realized the Google Home device was reading the Wikipedia page for Whopper. Wikipedia page is open for editing. People began entering ingredients. Amazon. Now you can see I'm dealing with big firms here, ones that should all know better. They had a recruiting tool that was gender biased. It was more favorable to men than women, and it began using AI to look at things like, well, this college is likely a women's college, so we'll downrate those resumes that have that college there. Why? It was trained on resumes submitted in the prior decade when, in fact, there was bias in hiring. And so it learned the bias and copied the bias. And Amazon claims they've abandoned the software and they actually never made a hire on this. Okay. And this was just this past summer. United Health produced a system to help predict and prescribe healthcare at reduced cost, and it favored white patients over sicker Black patients. They were trying to do a public service, and they were ultimately called into the government to report on this. I talked about proxy data. United Health doesn't actually have data on actual health. It has data on procedures that you go for, and it has data on what those procedures cost. So it used healthcare costs as a proxy for healthcare needs. Well, people who have less money spend less money on healthcare, and therefore their system concluded those people were healthier. Bad choice of proxy data. And the last one, which you may have seen in the newspapers this week, Zillow quits home flipping business, cites inability to forecast prices. Zillow went into a business saying they have access to all this data on housing, and they can predict housing price increases. So they're going to institutional buying up the houses, fixing them up, flipping them, and selling them as a profit. In less than a year, they lost over $500 million. They determined that their algorithm cannot effectively predict house prices. Okay. What do we learn from all of these? All of these are audit controls that you can consider, and actually you should consider and should have in place. Test with unexpected data. Secure the data. Test for ethical values. Test for bias. Test for obsolescence. Is the use a suitable use of AI? Did Microsoft really need a chatbot? Did Burger King really need to trick the Google machine? And validate your data model. They all failed, and these are companies that should know better. And there are many more things to worry about. There's adversarial AI, where people can use AI systems to attack your systems. Masking, you can see in this example here, a temple, someone overlaid what looks like noise, and the AI system thought it was an ostrich. How that can be is a separate conversation, and I can't fit into this window, but give me a call. People can synthesize data to mislead AI. Here, somebody came up with a sweater that has license plate figures on it. If you wear this, AI will think you're a car. And there are other examples of synthetic images. And when you manipulate the data, here AI was trained on a fire truck. By rotating it, it thinks it's something else. And you can poison data to mislead AI. In this case, strange, weird glasses were put on this person's face. For those of you who ever go through an e-gate and passport and immigration control, this is why they tell you to take off the glasses. And that caused the AI system to radically confuse who this person is. These are all real examples. And it makes you wonder. I pulled up to this car in a parking lot a few days ago. What would AI see here? And when you think about your AI systems, these are the type of vulnerabilities you can't control, and they're out there. So what do you need to do? The first thing you need to do is establish this thing called trust. And as you get into the AI space, especially the AI audit and control space, you're going to hear trust. And to give you the context, well, we go back generations of technology. We were building accounting systems. What was your control objective? Accuracy. When we got to the internet, what was your control objective regarding the value of the system? Engagement, clicks, downloads, things like that. When you got to cybersecurity, your control objectives was metrics of security, penetrations, exfiltrations, attacks, things like that. And then AI, you're going to find out it's about making it trustworthy, and that is a work in process. There is, however, a framework for trust. Trust is built on ethics, is built on explainability. You need all three, and you must be explainable to be ethical, and you must be ethical to be trustworthy. I've used this diagram from Deloitte, not because I used to work for Deloitte, but because I thought it was a good diagram. You can go to other websites and see similar diagrams. And what you can see is the components of what makes up trustworthy. Safe, secure, responsible, transparent, fair and impartial, all those things. You need to have audit compliance and validation, both of the AI system, life cycle, and afterwards in production. These things go into, if you can't say you're doing all these things, you're not going to be able to say that you have a trustworthy system. The OECD is trying to come up with standards for trustworthiness, inclusive growth, sustainability, well-being, human-centered values, explainability, robustness, security, accountability. Sounds like the same tune as the prior slide, but just more of the same. And if you Google it, there's a PDF to download where they discuss this in more detail. Microsoft has an interesting implementation. They have 6 principles, and you'll see it's the same: fairness, reliability and safety, privacy and security, inclusive access, transparency, accountability. They also provide an interesting insight into organization and governance. They have 2 committees. The Ether Committee advises leadership. Think of it as the visionary. What is the vision for AI? And the Aura is the operations committee. But you'll see other opportunities here, but they both need to be addressed. Advising leadership so that your business takes the right strategy and attitude and approach to AI, and then operational implementation to be sure that it executes in a manner that aligns with that. And again, if you're going to be involved in audit and control, these are things that must exist. Somebody says, oh, well, I don't need to do this. We're just doing an AI project just like a web page. No, you can't do that. Explainability. You need to be able to understand an AI decision. If I apply for a credit card and the bank says to me, or the credit card provider says, no, Al, we're denying you a card. And I say, why? They go, well, we have no idea. The computer did it. But that doesn't work, okay? No, it does not work. Think about the liability and the risk to your firm. Moreover, if you don't know why it denied me, maybe it gave me the card and it shouldn't. You need to understand. So explainability is essential, and it's an audit control. It's a challenge. It's not easy to do. AI thinking is not human thinking. Explaining prior decisions may not explain future ones, and you need to deal with regulations that may limit algorithms to explicitly explainable ones. But you, in an audit and control function, have to demand explainability. You can't be told, well, it's too hard, well, you don't understand, well, we're not sure, why don't we do this? You've got to get to it, or you're exposed. You've got to be sure your organization is organized for success. AI is a feature of the organization. If your business approaches a project, you're in big trouble. There are basic issues of governance, management, communications, all need to be addressed. I talked about how Microsoft is addressing it. You need to look into this. If you get tasked with this, you need to look at your organization top to bottom to see if your organization is addressing this properly. And when you adapt the organization, it's from the board on down. You need to engage the board. You need to form an AI ethics committee. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And you need to go through every single line of business. And oh, by the way, suppliers as well, and supply chain as well. And when I say AI enabled, that does not necessarily mean write AI applications for them. They need to be educated and be AI aware. IT has new responsibilities. HR has new responsibilities. Legal does. Everybody does. You can't just do a system and not go through the organization and have people understand how AI impacts their role in the organization. And you also need to proactively go out and identify barriers to success. An interesting data point from Gartner, 75 to 85% of all AI projects fail to meet their goals. That number may sound astronomical, it is, but when you go back and look at the 5 examples of failure that I presented, you go, yeah, I can get it. I can see how this is happening. The AI Ethics Committee, it's a term that is Googleable. It's the common term being used. It can be governance committee, organization committee, operations committee, call it what you want. But if you want to begin researching this and seeing what other people are doing, the language out there is the AI Ethics Committee, but its responsibility is far more than ethics. For those of you who participate in the internet transformation and the cybersecurity transformation, you know that the organization adapted. New structures. There was no CISO prior to cybersecurity. There was no data management. There was no web presence committee prior to the internet. The AI has transformed the organization similarly. And the AI Ethics Committee provides the leadership and governance to maintain trust, manage risk, and provide clear guidelines. You can't just hope everybody does their job properly. One of the most unique things about this is membership needs to be diverse, including community representatives. Now, what that means, you need to figure out based on your business and the application. But the folks at United Health certainly wish they had brought in people who were more than techies and more than data analysts to have a better understanding of the implications of what they did. Okay. I'm not going to go through this, but it's something that you can look at and reference on just forming the AI Ethics Committee and making sure that you go through an appropriate process. It's not different in that regard to forming other organizational entities, but you need to focus on all these things or you won't have a functioning AI Ethics Committee. You might want to consider modifying your review process for AI projects. When you look at this, if you look at the top half and the bars at the end, you see a conventional project review. It's submitted, it's assessed. We did identify ethical on the application. You need to do that, okay, but that's conventional. What's really new about AI is data review. In the same way that you review an application, you need to review the data, the strategy, the model, the sources, the readiness, assess it, identify risks, and define controls. When you look at the Zillow experience, you look at all of the 5 examples I showed you, a data review might have led to a very different outcome. And you need to consider adapting your lifecycle to create an AI system lifecycle. In yellow, I've highlighted all the appropriate places for controls. Please note 3 and 6, validate. You're going to hear that word again and again and again. When you did accounting systems, validation was easy. 2 + 2 is, we know the answer. You run something through an AI system. We don't know what the answer is. You know, Is it the answer we want? Was it yesterday? And then continue on 6. Just because I got the right answer yesterday doesn't mean I'll get the right answer tomorrow. One of the fascinating things about an AI system is you need to continuously audit it in production. And the development teams need to build the tools to allow you to continuously audit it. You can't deploy the system and come back 6 months later and say, well, let's run a test. First of all, you don't know what it's been doing for 6 months. Secondly, your developers are going to say, well, that's a project. You're going to go budget it. We're going to need a year. We've got other things to do. It's got to be built in from the beginning, as well as the staffing and the resources. It's important to apply risk management procedures. I talked about the OECD. They actually wrote in their statement, apply risk management. It's the same but different. So you've all seen this: identify, assess, assign, plan, execute. I've added 2 things, what I call axiomatic and corollary risk. And axiomatic risk is every system has a specific goal. Self-driving car, to drive a car safely. Credit card approvals, to approve credit cards. The axiomatic risk is what happens if it achieves the goal successfully, and what happens if it achieves the goal and fails. So axiomatic risk is it fails, it crashes somewhere. Axiomatic risk of success, well, we have self-driving cars. People say, oh, I don't need to pay attention. I'll just sit and play cards, have a drink. Well, guess what? Everything that's ever been done about safety in a vehicle, safety in an accident, is based on people sitting in their seats with a seatbelt on. What will be the safety issues when people rely on self-driving cars and start playing around in their car? That's an axiomatic risk of success. Now, corollary risks are what happens downstream, unforeseen behavior changes. They've said or hypothesized that when we have truly self-driving cars, people who live in crowded cities with expensive parking and limited parking space will never park their cars. They'll just have them keep driving around the block forever until they need the car again. Think about the pollution. Think about the congestion in the streets. Think about pedestrian safety. That's a corollary risk. And I encourage you to think about those terms when you look at AI systems. And then on the right, I talk about continuous testing, continuous communications. Today, oh, we're releasing a system. Oh, there's an update to our website. That won't cut it for AI. People actually need to understand what is happening, okay, and what to expect. Information technology and security, validation, validation, validation. Validate algorithms, test rigorously to understand and confirm behavior. Validate your training data. That's for training the system, not training the people. Use reference data sets to continuously and rigorously test and validate the performance of algorithms and the integrity of the underlying data. Think of it as continuously recalibrating the system based on known inputs and outputs. This is new. This is additional work. Validation is crucial. Enterprise risk management, they need to be at the table. I was thrilled to hear the prior speaker talk about apply your risk management practices, do your tabletop testing, have your contingency plans. Same thing here. And you have a whole gamut of problems. One is you depend on AI and the AI fails. Okay, what's your operational business continuity plan? Fine. Now AI succeeds and you have a public relations issue. How do you deal with that? What is your communications plan? What is your escalation plan? All those things, on and on and on. AI is enterprise risk management needs to be at the table, and all your plans need to be updated to reflect the impact of AI on your business. And I talked about other departments, legal, regulatory, procurement. All of those have impacts based on AI and the regulatory impact of AI, and those need to be addressed. This is just a sample of a few departments but they highlight the magnitude of change and the magnitude of transformation across the organization. So I actually am getting this done in the time frame. The reality is AI is different, but we really can't apply past lessons. It's a challenge. It transforms the whole organization. The risks are throughout the organization, and the entire organization must adapt. But you've been there before. You did it with the internet. You did it with cyber. You can do it again. But you must start with understanding AI. I've been to too many of these where people don't talk about what AI is, and you get to the Q&A and you realize that nobody understood anything because they started out with a misunderstanding of AI and they ended up with a misunderstanding of AI. You need to understand it, demystify it, and adapt it to the common experience. Promote successful organizational transformation, adapt risk management and control procedures. You can identify the risks and be sure there's a BCP plan for the AI disruption. Embrace the change. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thanks for hitting all the notes, and it's great to be on the same page. Thank you so much. I know we're running a bit late, so Bill.
Yeah, we're going to move right to the next person. And Alan, thank you very much. Everybody knows how to get in touch with it now too. So terrific. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, enjoyed it. Thank you. All right, so next up, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Raimundo Rodulfo. Raimundo is the City Beautiful's Chief Innovation Officer, Risk Management Leader. He'll be speaking to us about the smart city, including securing AI capabilities and IoT devices. So IoT is a great thing of interest to me. So looking forward to hearing from you about that. So Raimundo, you are up next.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the opportunity to share our story and to learn from the great presentations. I will share my screen.
Okay, thank you.
Please let me know if you see my screen.
You're good. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to talk a little bit about our AI use cases and in general, how we manage risks in our city, in our cyber infrastructure. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer, CIO, and Director of IT of City of Coral Gables. So, we work closely with our risk management experts in the city, and we manage the cyber infrastructure risk, the cybersecurity risks. So a little bit about my background. I started in the early 90s as an engineer in the telecommunications industry. My first exposure to AI, I remember, just fresh out of college, was working for an electronics industry, and I was developing an expert system. And I started using, for the firmware side of the expert system, what we used to call at that time genetic algorithms. And one of the first things that I learned is that those same algorithms that we were using to solve problems in electronics, in hardware and telecommunications, were the same kind of algorithms that were being used to develop computer viruses. So that's pretty much like an early exposure, almost 30 years ago, to the risk of AI, to adversarial AI, basically using AI both for good, to solve problems, to improve customer experience and quality of life, but at the same time, how that same technology can be used for harm, and how you have to protect your organization against those risks. So it's not, what I can tell you is that in my experience, we have been talking about AI in the telecommunications and the electronics industry for almost 30 years or more if you go to academia and to the scientific community. But we have seen an acceleration over the last 10 to 5 years. And now we are entering the age where AI is a transformational force, the same way how the internet was in the 90s when I started my engineering career. So I worked for 10 years in telecommunications and the electronics industry, multiple companies like Bell South, Siemens, Motorola, Agilent Technologies in Silicon Valley. Then I started in the public sector in 2004. And I have had the opportunity to build a great team from the ground up and building a cyber infrastructure that is smart, resilient, and provides excellent customer services to our citizens. That is the goal of our city. City of Coral Gables, in the center of Miami-Dade County, we are the home of the University of Miami, and we are the home of more than 140 multinational corporate headquarters. and more than 20 consulate and international trade offices. So we have a great ecosystem, and AI is one of those technologies that we leverage to improve quality of life as part of that portfolio of Industry 4.0 technologies. So, and I also am a volunteer, send them Pamela, our good friend, Pamela Gupta. We are co-chairs of super clusters in the National Institute of Standards and Technology, GCTC. And I had the opportunity to collaborate with this great team in multiple other initiatives. So our Smart City framework, or an architecture of frameworks, has 8 major components. And the same way how you have a table with 3 legs, and you cannot remove one of the 3 legs because the table will fall. The same way we have this framework with 8 strategic management areas that are key. And at the top is that vision of Industry 4.0 for quality 4.0. And where basically we're trying to improve quality of life. Every project, every technology aligns with that mission. And every project is a strategic project. Every AI project, every Industry 4.0, IoT, or cybersecurity project aligns with that mission as well. So this framework is meant to bring those considerations at the early ideation process, at the engineering and design process of every technology, of every service, of every project. So fast forwarding. So after we talk about focus areas, quick wins, quality engineering, process improvement, organizational plans, and building a foundation of high-speed communication, then we are talking about framework number 4 that we call is a smart city engineering framework, is building that stack of cyber infrastructure with multiple layers, where we have that resilient foundation of high-speed communication that has to be secure. In our case, in Florida, has to be able to survive hurricanes and survive major disasters and power outages, but also has to be able to be intelligent and leverage AI for automated failovers. And of course, leverage best practices in cybersecurity to protect the enterprise from that first foundation of digital inclusion and broadband. Then we build that cyber physical layer of smart devices. And we build that layer of intelligence in the cloud, of hybrid and distributed cloud, when we can use AI to make sense of millions of data points coming from all those cyber physical systems. And of course, managing the risks and the trust that needs to occur at all those different components. To the Smart City Hub, where we serve an ecosystem, a smart city ecosystem that is people-centric, that has people, businesses, organizations. It has things, smart devices, and smart systems. But we also have to treat as personas that are part of that ecosystem. So that ecosystem needs to be able to, each one of the members of that ecosystem need to be able to trust each other. So that's one of the big challenges in trust. And of course, when we apply AI to that ecosystem, we have the same challenges. So moving forward to interoperability between systems to eliminate silos that also can create risk. When you have multiple silos, you have other kind of risks. You don't have interoperability, you are not able to apply common structures and business rules and intelligence to all the members of that complex data governance ecosystem. So that's why you need to have interoperability, and we apply that as framework number 5. Same way as best practices in enterprise systems, including the use of AI in enterprise systems, and having a strategic management portfolio of projects that is managed with best practices as well, because all those best practices have to exist from the very beginning of any project, before the project becomes an actionable project. And strategic partnerships that gives us the collaboration and the synergy to augment our capacity and our risk management infrastructure. And in those strategic projects, you will see multiple areas like enterprise systems, public safety technologies, content management and digital experience, and the user experience, where AI is being applied a lot today. Most of the digital experience platforms of DSP today, like the ones we're implementing, they have an AI component for the user experience. And of course, that brings other challenges. And I have heard the experts that spoke before, they spoke of about some of those scenarios where AI can also bring uncertainty and also unpredictable behaviors and risk as well. and cyber infrastructure that we build as smart buildings, smart roads, smart urban landscapes that also interact directly with the citizens and are exposed to the outdoor, are exposed also to a lot of risks because we have extended our enterprise from our network to the extranet, then to the outdoors, to the street. And smart city initiatives in general that leverage some of those special technology use cases that were not part of the traditional way of doing things, of doing business in technology and in the public sector in 5 or 10 years ago. So managing risk. So a holistic strategy, in our case, always, regardless of the complexity of the portfolio, as pretty much as a framework or a foundation. Start with risk assessment and risk management. So we need to understand what we have. Like having a house, you need to understand every window in the house, every door in the house, but then you need to understand how secure is your undergrounding in that house, how secure is the roof in that house, because that's the last place you will think that you will be attacked from. So the traditional ways, the traditional methodologies and techniques of attack are evolving, sometimes faster than the protection mechanisms that you have. So you start with that risk assessment. And when you bring AI to the picture, like it was very well stated by experts in previous presentations, so then you bring a lot of unknowns and unpredictable risks. So that's where your protection mechanisms, your strategy has to be heuristic. They have to have the adaptability, the composability, the flexibility to adapt to the unknown scenarios. And that's beyond 0 days attacks. So we were talking about 0 day attacks for many years, but that goes beyond that. It's beyond 0 day. It's adversarial AI systems that have that lateral movement that can really cause damage in your infrastructure, systems that really can disguise themselves and be perceived as part of the production environment really easy because they are smart, they can adapt. So that kind of ability to react, that composability, that flexibility and adaptability to the unknown, to the uncertainty is what makes your network resilient in this day and age. And we are not even talking about post-quantum encryption. Then you're gonna have other risks with quantum, but let's talk about that maybe next year. They say that quantum is gonna see a big adoption next year and the following ones. At this time, risk assessment is key. And of course, that has to do with security awareness, educating your users, educating your constituents. In our case, in our city, we educate also our businesses, our business community, our population, because at the end, now everybody is a stakeholder in defending the customer service enterprise that we have. Not only the city employees, the contractors, the users of our system, they are all part now of that line of defense. So you have to educate your community as well. And protection, so building that protection mechanisms. And now it's becoming more complex as well. So you have to design it to be intelligent because you are not protecting simply with DDoS or with firewalls or filters and IPS. Now you are protecting about unpredictable and undetectable behavior. So that's where you have to build that intelligence, that advanced threat detection capability as well into the detection side of your strategy. And technology management now has to do with not only keeping the lights on and managing the life cycle of your equipment and your infrastructure. You have to continuously not only renew and refresh your capital, you have to improve it constantly, but you have to innovate. So you have to make it, you have to bring the innovation as part of the strategy of managing the life cycle. In the past, you can say, okay, I'm going to manage the life cycle in a way that I keep my systems up to date with latest version. It goes beyond that. You have to continuously challenge the process, challenge the architecture, challenge the infrastructure you are providing, because it can become old really quick, even though if it looks new. It can be new. It can be a 2021 product, and it's old for you because it doesn't address the challenges of the environment. So you have to continuously be ready to disrupt. to disrupt, because otherwise you will be disrupted in a negative way. And response, always ready to respond, but also you need to build hyper automation in your response capabilities. So your system need to be able to not only alert you, but being able to block, respond, react to unpredictable behavior by adversarial AI or by complex systems that can attack you. And that ability to respond in a smart way comes with bringing AI, white hat AI to your organization that can protect you against those risks. And compliance. So the auditors, they are your friends, even though they bring a lot of challenges and complexity and complications to your processes, but really you need to bring constantly those fresh eyes from outsiders that are experts that are going to look at your processes, at your systems. We ourselves in the city, we undergo more than 8 to more audits every year from multiple third-party organizations that they test our systems. And there's always something that they know that you don't know. There's always something they see that you don't see. And there's always the opportunity to improve and to remediate gaps before they become higher risks. So that's a continuous improvement process that has to be aided by third parties, by outsiders. And so when we talk about artificial intelligence use cases, there are many more than this, but I'm going to only talk about 12. For example, the use of computer vision, AI and machine learning applied to video feeds from optical sensors, from cameras, from systems that are located in our smart districts. So we have to detect, classify, analyze, and count different kinds of objects in traffic, like vehicles, pedestrians, like multimodal transportation, like micromobility type of systems. But at the same time, we need to have the visibility for public safety and systems like ALPR, like CCTV, like speed sensors, etc. They bring that capability to our Community Intelligence Center for first responders. But also they help urban planners, officials, businesses, and we are constantly counting those anonymous objects. Basically, we are counting objects, and the anonymized data help us also to protect privacy and to comply with data governance. And other use case is producing and sharing actionable analytics to the public in a Smart City Hub public platform, coralgables.com/smartcity. So we share that data with the constituents, with students, with university professors, and with the ecosystem. And that data is used for economic growth, for innovation, is used also for insight, for studies that can be scientific studies, environmental studies, and in general, they bring a lot of value. And of course, that comes from data governance and from segmentation, from classification of those data domains, and that have to be highly regulated and classified to comply with a lot of regulatory requirements. So we are a highly regulated agency, and as such, we have to comply with a lot of different frameworks that goes from protecting PII, CJI, PCI, and PHI for HIPAA, for example. So each one of those domains, they have a challenge of its own. And when you are an open data organization, you are sharing basically a fraction of the data that you can share that belongs to that kind of data that has been already sanitized or anonymized, or by itself is classified as open data. At the same time, you have to protect the data that belongs to any of those highly regulated domains. And that's where you have to have a lot of controls in place, from data segregation to network segmentation, encryption, etc. So predictive crime analytics, so that's part of that visibility for public safety, like having the ability to use data in real time, but also historic analysis of data, and predict behavior of crime or traffic accidents using machine learning. And that information is very useful for first responders, and that gives them the ability to have strategies that are focused on data and insight. And smart city poles, I'm going to show you an example. We have new technologies. In the past, we had multiple smart city poles with different technologies like ALPR, CCTV, environmental sensors, and public Wi-Fi. But now we combine all of those in one single integrated AI pole. So like I said before, there's a lot of value and use cases and ROI for first responders and for the residents of the city. But at the same time, there's a responsibility of managing the risks of this complex infrastructure. And this is an example of how those analytics are presented to the public in the Smart City Hub. Traffic counts of different kinds. We have what we call an urban analytics AI platform, where all that data is aggregated, millions of data points, and using correlation and analytics, we present a visualization of that data that helps the customers, that helps the users. And this is an example of our smart districts in Coral Gables, so multiple smart districts. And higher concentration that you see in this map is, of course, the central business district, where we have the highest concentration of intelligence and IoT and fiber corridors and wireless mesh networks and public Wi-Fi and other technologies. And we are extending all those districts to different areas of the city, and we have built corridors. And now we are expanding those smart districts to areas adjacent to the University of Miami and to the main highway and to adjacent cities like City of Miami and City of South Miami. So we are connecting also to neighbor municipalities, trying to create that kind of innovation synergy in our region when we share data and we share insight between multiple agencies. And an example of Internet of Things that goes from smart lights throughout the city to traffic and parking sensors, public safety equipment of different kinds, environmental sensors like air quality, water quality sensors, noise sensors, and smart devices that are part of the ecosystem, even though if they are just talking about crowdsourced device. Like for example, we connect to the data from Waze. Millions of drivers using the Waze app. We connect to that database through an agreement with Google Waze, and that data is ingested into our Smart City Hub, where we do correlation with other IoT that we have. So that's the correlation between crowdsourced data and citizen engagement data that is provided to smart devices to our enterprise IoT networks as well. So we have connected fleets. Now we have pilots for autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, connected vehicles. The city is building a new set of different smart mobility hubs, basically retrofitting or transforming what used to be parking garages or parking lots in the past to mobility hubs that are multi-use, multimodal. They are ready for the present and the future of connected and autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, and drones, drone delivery, in the future, vertical mobility as well. So those hyper-connected hubs bring then some of the challenges that some of the experts were talking before, that hyper-connectivity and hyper-automation of transportation, of mobility objects, bring a lot of other risks and considerations when we start connecting all those devices to the enterprise. Something to consider also as part of the design and the engineering of these systems. This is the Smart City AI integrated pole that I mentioned before. So this is the first of its kind in the country. We installed it this year, and it combines, like I said before, in one single pole, all those different smart city poles that we used to have before, like ALPR, CCTV, smart light controllers, environmental sensors, public Wi-Fi, 5G, nano hotspot, and red light cameras, and many other devices, so more than 12, all combined in one single AI-powered pole device that has the edge analytics and the AI-driven predictive analytics also to analyze all that data at the edge. So these kind of devices may be what we're going to start deploying from now on, because it reduces the footprint, consolidates the system, improves interoperability, and in certain way reduces the risk of having multiple disconnected devices that have to be connected at the cloud layer with APIs. Now, this kind of integration, integrated systems also bring a lot of benefits on that respect. And drones, so that goes back to the mobility challenge. So bringing AI and hyper automation and hyperconnectivity to mobility. So when we have all those different use cases of drones that we have in our city, we started using those drones as flying sensors. So we apply also AI and computer vision algorithms at the incident command post, for example, to apply to video feed coming from those drones and derive insight about the terrain, for example, identify water deterioration in rooftops of buildings, or the conditions and the equipment located in our telecommunication towers, and also analyzing sites that are hazardous, or rescue recon scenarios after a hurricane, where we have to send drones. So applying AI in real time to all those systems have also a lot of value and capabilities. But we have started to hear a lot about the risks of this kind of UAS. So this kind of autonomous drone systems, they also bring a lot of risks, and there are already discussions about using technology that will be able to counter adversarial drone technology that also leverages AI and presents other risks. So this is a case where we have been bringing a lot of value, but organizations worldwide now are thinking about the risks of this kind of technology as well. And I talked already about smart parking systems, which is another application of AI for computer vision. And we have also the cases like using AI for public sentiment analytics. So we use AI and ML in our public sentiment platforms to analyze the feedback, the response from the citizens to topics and to issues geographically. And we can use AI, for example, during COVID-19, during the pandemic, we used AI and IoT data to measure, to analyze the impact of the pandemic into traffic, into the environment, and how the policies that the city were applying affected also those parameters. Other uses of AI, like our chatbot, we call it IDA. So we have that feature in our Smart City Hub. It's called Ask IDA. IDA is a smart, is a artificial intelligence digital assistant that we developed in collaboration with an MIT scientist, and was funded by NSF. And now IDA is helping the users to navigate the complexity of our smart city systems. I talk about bringing AI also to cybersecurity systems and to other uses. So basically, these are photos of our infrastructure and use cases. And lastly, I would say that one of the most important use cases of AI in our city has to do with the collaboration. With organizations like yours and with the NEACS GCTC. And so thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I say goodbye with a photo of our amazing team in the Coral Gables IT department. Thank you.
Wow, Raimundo, you continue to amaze me. And I'm so thankful to you for spending time with us, given the complexity of the rest I just saw on the screen before. So thank you. And I know I have so many questions.
Yes.
Shot on Wednesday.
Oh, no.
Okay, I'm hearing a echo.
Yes.
He's really not good. He's
I'm
not
so
coming.
sorry.
She's coming.
Okay. So Raimundo, I do have a question for you, and I know we are waiting to hear from the Colonel too. Colonel Barnes, is it fine if we go into your time for 2 minutes? I'll let.
Okay.
Okay, great. All right. So Raimundo, I had one thing I wanted to steal from you is that triad, the CIA triad. I had talked about the essential pillars of cybersecurity for AI. And I said, we need another pillar, which is privacy, should very much be a part of this. So I'm definitely going to steal that one from you. Okay. But the question I have for you is some of the AI technology that you mentioned, emotive technology for AI, for recognition of emotions, et cetera, that's still baking in and not really fully vetted out. And I'll be really interested in talking to you about how to put in the right guardrails around that. Okay. How do you sleep at night? It would be a good question, because you are really doing a fantastic job of showing the promise of AI, right? And how we can use these IoT, for example, and integrating that into AI. So this is very, very motivating, but also I can understand the risk that you're looking at.
Yes, when you add more complexity to the infrastructure, when you extend your enterprise to the outdoors, to the outside plant, you are bringing all those risks. Those risks, they exist in infrastructure, in urban infrastructure as a whole. You are building bridges, you are building roads, so you are also providing services to the public, and you are also adding risks. So good engineering, good practices, managing those risks from the ideation and the design phase, but never as an afterthought. And of course, you will never think about all the scenarios. There are things that you have to be able to continuously adapt and to learn.
Wow. So I know I have a lot of things I want to follow up with you with. So just want to end with your slide, your presentation with one slide that can kind of give an idea of what Raimundo is dealing with, right? This is some of the risks that you talked about in my talk, for example, at the London AI Summit. When we talk about cybersecurity for ML systems, this is an example of how complex it is compared to software development in the conventional world, because not only can you go into data poisoning, model stealing, model inversion, these are all fully meshed areas in their own right. And to actually come up with how can we identify the risks, it doesn't stop even when you roll these systems out, because I don't have time to go into this, but I just wanted to give you an idea of, this is a cybersecurity based conference, so didn't want to leave you without a slide on what is a data set poisoning. For example, Alan had mentioned that this would not even be visible to the naked eye, but so even if you put a human in the loop, for example, for some of the processing, but for the machine, it's seeing that this is not a dog, it's actually a fish, for example. The only way is what he mentioned, which is to do this proactively. And I will share one slide with you, and maybe I'll mail this out to you because I don't want to keep the Kono waiting, where we can leverage what we have done in the past in cybersecurity and use it for going forward, for proactively identifying risk surface and protecting ourselves, such as the compression example I gave you, where the original image is what these systems learn on. And if we had if we compress these images, it may very well reduce the attack surface. And that's just one example. So Bill, I hand it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Raimundo. My pleasure now to introduce our final keynote of the day, Colonel David Barnes, who's from the U.S. Army, and he is going to, I'm sure, give us a lot of new insight, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So thank you very much for joining us. And Colonel, I assume you have your own presentation you'd like to share, and there you go. You brought it up. That's fantastic. And
all right, great. Now I'd like to ensure that it's there. Let's make sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Excellent.
Hope everyone can see that. All right, great.
Yes, thank you.
And thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. I mean, really an honor to be able to speak with you today. And especially to follow on as the last keynote of what has been an incredible conference with expertise from across this great problem space. First, my bit of a disclaimer that these are my personal views and don't necessarily reflect those of the DoD, the U.S. Army, the United States Military Academy, or the United States government. Right, having said that, though, obviously, I work for the Army and the DoD, and so much of what I have to say is in keeping with the DoD's adoption of the AI ethics principles, et cetera. And I'm also very excited to follow Raimundo's really detailed talk about, in particular, the use cases and how widespread artificial intelligence is integrated in a city's IT management program and where the future really lies, right? I mean, we have to think that AI really will become ubiquitous. So clearly when people think about the Army or DoD, focus may be on how AI is going to transform the battlefield. But in reality, that is only part of the overall program in the department, because much like in the city planning and IT management there, the DoD and the Army plan to use AI all the way from the back office, more mundane applications to those on the battlefield. But I'm going to pull it back a bit out of that, some of the detail, and I'm going to make a case again for why people are critical, why intentional and widespread human input throughout the life cycle, whether we're talking a AI system used to screen resumes or for lethal autonomy. It's absolutely critical when we think about using it responsibly. So we are the LIMFAC. And yes, we people are the LIMFAC. And those of you who've worked with the Department of Defense know that we love our acronyms. We love taking words and slamming them together and making new ones. And I think it drives a lot of our colleagues outside crazy. In fact, it's fun to try to keep up with it. Well, LIMFAC is actually an old joint term. And the idea is, what are the limiting factors? The limiting factors could be in terms of planning. There could be limiting factors or LIMFACs in terms of actually conducting operations. But we are the impact when it comes to AI and AI ethics. And what I mean is that a lot of the focus in the news, right, and much of what we've talked about the last couple of days are really focused on the technical problems and potential technical failures, right? Some of them are very well known, right? An autonomous vehicle that runs a stop sign. We just talked, Pamela mentioned about data poisoning again, and we heard in Mark's talk and in Alan's talk, other areas of concern where the insurance is weighing options in the cyber domain, and Alan's talk about all the varieties of adversarial AI and potentials for failure there. But we really have to understand that it's us, it's the people who are developing, deploying, and using the technology in the world today and in the future. And it's our decisions, regardless of where we sit on an AI lifecycle, that matter. So here's an example. Even when an individual is optimizing code, she brings her particular worldview, whether consciously or not, into her decisions about which code to optimize. In a sense, she's making a values-laden decision that can affect downstream in a developmental process, and also when that AI-enabled system is eventually deployed. So Brian Christian's excellent book, The Alignment Problem, not to advertise for his book, really wants to ensure that our AI models capture our norms, values, understand what we mean or intend, and above all, do what we want. But again, we need to think of AI, regardless of its broad definition right now, right, as a tool for us to improve our lives, improve our society. He describes that machine learning systems grow not just increasingly pervasive, but increasingly powerful. We find ourselves more and more often in a position of the sorcerer's apprentice, if you all remember the old cartoon. We conjure a force, autonomous but totally compliant, give a set of instructions and scramble like mad to stop it once we realize our instructions perhaps are imprecise or incomplete. Bit of a paraphrase there. So actually how the systems may be fielded and used later on are other examples of human decision in terms of this AI lifecycle. So for example, you can very simply look at a lot of ethical concerns related to an AI system as, well, does it work or not work? And Alan drew out some detail about this, right, with axiomatic risk and corollary risk. But you think about it, right, there's concerns about facial recognition systems because it's not ready to be deployed. It doesn't work as intended, right? There's bias in the data set, and then we have untrained or undertrained personnel employing it in a way that it is. but you also have ethical concerns on whether it works exactly as we intended it to do. And let's say that it doesn't have those other associated risks, right? There will be other risks that will grow out of it, though, because who's to say that some other entity, a government, could use that same technology to subjugate another population. So my point is, regardless, again, of where you sit in development and deploying of that system, in thinking about it as a customer that you want to use the AI system, or when you're actually employing on the other end, or because it'll be democratized, right? And and the technology will be out in the world, how it may be used differently when the way you intended are all related to us, the humans. We are the limfac making these important determinations. So you think about algorithmic bias, for example. We have to remember that for many of the large firms that are using search algorithms, for example, there is an army, as it were, an army of humans that are labeling and curating the data, right? So again, much like the optimizing code example, she is inputting and labeling a particular set of data, well-intended, right? Maybe imparting some sort of bias in there, bias about the world as it is, not necessarily the world the way we want it to be. Now, I've been fortunate to be involved with the Department of Defense adoption of the Defense Innovation Board's AI ethics principles. And I think these are an excellent start, right? And so the Secretary of Defense signed the memo in May 2021, right? And excuse me, in February 2020, and then the new Deputy Secretary of Defense memo implementing responsible AI in the DoD was signed just this last May. But the idea now is taking these principles, right, which seem very valuable, an initial great start, and putting them into practice. Much of what Alan had talked about is a way of doing that. So as many may recall, Marc McClennan did a study, right, identified 36 major sets of AI principles or guidelines, right? It's quite an eye chart, but it's fantastic. And what's important about it is one is to recognize how critical thinking about our human values and what we want this technology to do for us, how widespread that concern is. And quite frankly, these, although they're multiple, tend to bucket down into to some key areas. But even if we had agreed on these principles, there are still some open questions that still need to be addressed as we're advancing in our technological research. For example, many remain skeptical about the efforts to code ethics principles for AI. So think of McDowell's anti-codifiable thesis. They ask whether it's even achievable and would doing so be sufficient. And so while each of these principles describes an aspect of design development and deployment and use of AI, many can argue that such an ethics-based framework driven by principles is needed, but how then do we make these principles effective? Again, we are the limfac. We are the ones who identify these principles, and now we're trying to find a way to incorporate it into our technology, but also into our process involving that technology. So ethics ain't a dirty word, I've said to many senior leaders around the department. Concerns of the AI principles or adoption of them seem to fall into two broad categories. First, principles seem academic or aspirational, right? They're somewhat intuitive. They do reflect some common beliefs related to ethical concerns, but they seem amorphous, even ambitious. We need to dig deeper and define what it means to be equitable, what it means to be fair. And different organizations, different companies have tried to do that, but do their attempts really align? For example, what does it mean to be responsible? And from a practical standpoint, how do we ensure, right? How do we know if we're achieving fairness? What metrics of performance, what measures of effectiveness should we have that's achievable and measurable? How do we translate that to return on investment for a company? What are associated costs with making a system transparent at that level versus a different level? And as Alan mentioned, how do we translate these principles so that everyone in our organizations, not just the data scientists, not just those involved in the AI ethics piece of it, understand them, embrace them, and use them to guide their decisions, right? To make those hard calls, the organizational cultures need to change, right? To be able to raise a red flag when there's potentially a problem. The other area of concern, the other bucket of concern is that For many, ethics talks and smells too much like compliance, and people shy away from it. We all certainly want to be ethical, but no one likes somebody looking over her shoulder, checking on her actions and decisions. Unfortunately, this has been the unanticipated result in many organizations. Ethics for many in the business community means limitations, constraints, forms, even lawyers. No offense to any of my lawyer friends out here. All roadblocks or hurdles preventing us from developing the next widget, stretching the research boundary. Well, we shouldn't be terribly surprised by this initial reaction, because while we all recognize that there are legal requirements and compliance programs, these programs are often perceived as burdensome. We're almost like teammates, that lead these efforts are almost as welcome as like internal affairs on a police TV show. We're here to help you, right? So this view as ethics as compliance, or as the AI ethics labs calls ethical policing or gatekeeping, remains in many ways attractive, though, because it builds upon familiar checklist use, right? The more complete documentation, the more metrics we develop, right, we will be able to tackle and ensure that we have the ethical AI that we desire. But the problem with this kind of approach, right, it lures into complacency that maybe these are binary go, no go, ethical or not ethical decisions, as if AI ethics problems were so transparent and so obvious. So I think what we need is two lines of effort, and much of the work of the last 2 days has talked about this. The first is continue work refining this set of principles that you're operating off of into something that's tangible and concrete, understandable, and promulgated throughout your organization. The second line of effort is, instead of solely researching ethics as a compliance solution, we need to think about how we're going to incorporate these principles throughout the developmental AI lifecycle, not just as a number of discrete compliance gates. And I've had the pleasure of conversations both inside the department and externally with large tech firms and smaller tech firms. And as an example, I understand that everyone is wrestling with this concept, right? And we need to get it right. I was even in a conversation earlier today with a colleague and another company about what's going to happen when regulation comes. What kind of regulation at the national, international level? What details are going to look like? How are we going to ensure that we're not going to stifle innovation when that regulation comes out? So an example that we use in the Army, we've borrowed is from Carnegie Mellon's, and it's the AI stack. Many of you are, I'm sure, familiar with it. The AI stack treats each level as a tech block that needs to be worked on, but the stack demonstrates how interrelated the processes are. And you notice along the entire vertical axis is the ethics block. So this is an excellent example, I think, of how you can begin to think about how you can incorporate ethics into the entire process, right? Ethics in the stack model, it's the idea that ethics here will horizontally link the various blocks. Now, this is helpful and allows us to conceptually visualize, but even with this model, ethical considerations could be relegated to an afterthought. Each level of the stack potentially raises legal, ethical, or societal concerns, but our focus on our tech block, we may unconsciously regulate these concerns as somebody else's responsibility. We may pass the buck down the line, as it were, or else the ethics block would need to be a whole system of systems and some kind of integrator. So questions remain, if we're going to take the stack and we consider it for wide adoption, then how do we integrate ethics within each of these blocks? So, but again, I think those decisions in incorporating and translating these principles through something like the stack, right, are our decisions, because again, we're the limb fact. So I hope you agree that we're all responsible, but being the limb fact is not necessarily a bad thing. I believe that humans as the AI limb fact is something that actually work out for our benefit and for societies. Humans as the AI limb fact reflects humanity's necessary role in responsible development and deployment of responsible AI. It's the work that's done to bring our inputs from each of our particular positions, each of our areas of expertise, and then weigh the potential consequences of each of those decisions. So take how we normally think of R&D in the past and how we're shifting to it in the future, right? For example, in the government developing a new weapon system, but for any product, for a company, we know that there will be a legal review before it's actually fielded. And it's going to be checked to ensure that it's, and for us, it's compliant with all the local national laws, and for the government, compliance with international laws, like the law of armed conflict. But now with the expensive investment in cyber and AI, and the amount of resources required to move the technology along, we can't wait to the end of this process in order to evaluate whether we've not only met any legal hurdles, right, but that it's going to be in keeping with our values and going to be ethical, right? And so it seems sort of minor choices need to be made along the way, but these minor choices that we have can compound along the way. And those of you who work with the government know that we're terrible at software development historically, right? And we've used waterfall for a long time and have been reluctant to adapt to something new. And now we're moving to more DevSecOps. You know, in the Army, we call it soldier-centered design. We're trying to coach the Army and DoD how to better educate everyone in our organization, right? Because decision makers, those who hold the purse strings, those who are actually developing this technology all need to be integrated of it. So in other words, if we look at a linear lifecycle model, right? You know, designed, deployed, and used, you might think of where we need to shift. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if we take just the design part and adopt the British double design model, we need to be thinking about ethical, legal, and societal concerns at the far left of the double diamond, before we even get into addressing and defining what the problem actually is. It has to inform how we approach that question of what the problem is we're trying to solve. Now, a way to do that is you take a generic life cycle, and this is something that you know, different organizations have different ones, and I've just used this to teach some executives at the JAIC and elsewhere, but just to think through this process, right? And as I mentioned, normally we have the legal review before employment, but so the question then is, how do we bring it forward? How do we do this earlier on? So part of the question is well, when is an AI system really ready, right? When we're moving a system to the market, releasing the system in the wild, procuring a new weapons technology, right? When do we think that it's ready? Well, again, we need to do this earlier on, in a way that we've been testing out through a program at DARPA called Urban Reconnaissance Through Supervised Autonomy, is to bring a panel of subject matter experts early into the process to help identify for the performers what potential constraints, or if not constraints, what considerations in the legal, moral, and ethical realm ought they consider as they're working on the process. In this case, it's using AI-enabled autonomy in an urban environment to help a squad for reconnaissance, right? A very difficult problem. And you can imagine the kind of both legal and ethical concerns that ought to be considered. But having such a large and august body of subject matter experts, you know, no company or organization can afford to have that for each of them, right? So it's taking best practices such as that and seeing how that you can better integrate that into a process that makes sense for your organization, that will bring you the return on investment that you desire, and that will not be overly constraining. And Alan, I thought did a nice job of laying out some of the concerns that anyone seeking to develop that for their organization, some of the critical elements that they must include. And a big part of it, I think, is you know, for the Army, for the DoD, is risk management. And this was mentioned by a number of our speakers today. And Raimundo mentioned it about one of the key priorities is identifying, you know, the risk to AI. And Pamela, you mentioned associated other risks with poisoning and other kinds of attack. Doing proper risk management, right? Not just risk to mission, risk to force, as we would say in the DoD, but expanding the scope and thinking about those legal, policy, societal, and ethical concerns is a way to help identify the hazards, help to make take mitigation steps, develop those controls, implement them, document them, and then for us, you know, be able to identify at which level is the approval authority for that particular project. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is for the Army and DoD is not create a whole nother program, but again, look at historically how well we've done in our acquisition and in our testing, evaluation, validation, and verification programs, and see how we can better incorporate a wider scope to risk management and consider these ethical and legal concerns. And a way might look something like this, right? So think of risk management. You have throughout the sective ops process in the sprints, subject matter expertise that would weigh in throughout the life cycle of a system. Now, this seems very focused on risk management. And one thing I need to stress before I move on quickly is that having addressed risk management is a necessary component of having ethical AI or ethical cyber, but it's not sufficient. In the same way, the earlier conversation about trust, having it trustworthy, having it reliable is going to be necessary, but not necessarily sufficient. Again, because we have to be broad in our thinking and look at not only what we're developing, but how it may be employed, how it may be employed for other purposes that we may not intend. So a quick review about human decisions again, and I'll close out here briefly, but I can go in question and answers about the Army strategy and the DoD strategy moving forward. But again, when we think about in the design and development process, where that design team, and it needs to be diverse, it needs to have different expertise, different experiences, a different set of eyes. We have to remember that the initial goal of the system is one that we as humans have to define, and then we have to translate that in ones and zeros. The choices that we make along the way in support of that, the assumptions, the simplifications, the trade-offs, they're all going to shape the behavior of that particular algorithm, right? And a key point at the bottom is, like, everyone in the process doesn't need to understand every step of it. We all don't need to be experts in coding an algorithm, right, to how ML works. We do need to understand, though, where our choices and where we have input to that process is one that brings in those ethical and legal concerns, right? What is the problem we're trying to solve? Again, as I mentioned this, right, when we translate that, how do we translate that general goal into the mathematical formulas or functions? And sometimes we often forget this. When we think about, proxy variables, right, about the data, AI systems are as good as the data they've been trained on, and a number of speakers have raised this concern, right? And many phenomena that people are interested in predicting don't have simple definitions that correspond to these, right? I mean, we're working through them, right? The example of in the healthcare community, right? How if you're concerned about saving money and concerned about a better distribution of the healthcare that you have available and the priority to those who need it the most, and concerns with those that may be underrepresented, well, all those may result in some sort of trade-off, and those are intentional decisions that we have to keep in mind. And oftentimes in the real world, right, we don't have those translations, and we use proxies for them. Bias, there's a lot of conversations about bias, but oftentimes bias is because of the data itself. But a lot of times we incorporate, again, our own biases, whether we are conscious of them or not, into all the decisions behind the choices that we make here. Let's see. So I think another key piece of this to remember in terms of us being the LIMP Act is like that responsible AI ethics, right? It's not a one and done, right? We need to iterate on it. It needs to be cyclical. It needs to be deliberate. Documentation is the key, but we ought not be overwhelmed by it. In fact, is there a way that we could leverage the technology to assist us with that, right? It needs to be interdisciplinary, right? How could such decisions be left to the intuitions of people without expertise in these topics? And unfortunately, it often is, right? If I'm a data scientist, I may have no background in policing, but I may be required to write an algorithm in support of looking at the distribution of past crimes in a region, and I have no study of that. So who is helping me understand that problem so that I can help develop the best algorithm in support of what those goals are. So I'll leave you with this last slide because I don't want to be keeping everybody from the rest of their activities today. But this is a way that the Army is thinking about AI ethics, right? And you've heard these same ideas kind of resonate in earlier talks. So, you know, the three major lines of effort that we're working on is establish an Army-wide AI culture. So it's not just the AI ethicist, it's not just somebody like Dave Barnes, but does every soldier from the youngest private all the way to the Secretary of the Army understand the promise of AI, but also the potential risks and the limitations of artificial intelligence, and in a responsible way. Of course, much of the conversation is how do we operationalize those principles, right? How do we pool the ethical, legal, societal policy concerns, the risk management into our current processes and make it as seamless as possible, not become overly burdensome, to help us get the end product that we actually desire. And then the last line of effort is collaboration, right? Collaboration between, you know, the Army, between academia, between the corporate community, between the rest of DoD and our partners and allies. Because quite frankly, as I mentioned earlier, we are all wrestling in this problem space. And anyone who tells you that they have the complete solution, you need to be at least take a pause. They may have identified new techniques or best practices in certain aspects of it, but it's only together through conversations like we're having over the last 2 days that'll help us go back to each of our own constituent cultures and organizations to help better our own processes to ensure that the AI technology that we're developing is going to be not just useful for us, right, but it's going to be beneficial and to our customers and beneficial to society. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Colonel. I think we need to clone you and have more of your guidance, definitely. I do want to, I'll monitor, because Bill had to drop, I'll monitor the chat for any questions. But I do want to share, because I don't think you were there in the my morning keynote, and I do want to share one thing with you.
Please.
The problem I see, and I would like to ask you, is we're already rolling these systems out, right? We are seeing half-baked technology that can get us into deeper problems if we are not cognizant of the risks right now. So we know what the risks are. Let me just do this really quickly, if you don't mind. This is what I'm sharing my screen or not. Let me make sure. It's been a long day, long 2 days. So I want to make sure I'm not. There we go. This is what I had talked about yesterday, but algorithmic damages that is already happening right now, right? And it's not to call out any particular one over here, because like I said yesterday, it's the flavor du jour, right? What is happening today could be, it's not on my slide because I was sleeplessly preparing for this one. I had to use a previous slide. But what is going on, right? This is not something we are prepared for. So this is the kind of conversations we need to have, and we'll have to look at it holistically. I totally agree. Let me just see if this is what the purpose of this conference is. It's a cybersecurity conference, but we have always had a partnership between audit, between governance and security, and actions that need to lead to dialogues that lead to action, as you saw in the conference that you had attended for us for the Vice's Trusted AI Affiliate, which was also, we need the dialogues, we need the question, and we need the answers. So what I wanted to talk about is two things. Emotional AI, for example, facial recognition. I talked about this yesterday. I'm not going to go into that. However, when we are going to look at the solution, because I want for our audience to go away with solutions, not just the one which is in Zoom, because this is only for the presenters, but the audience is really looking for answers as well, right? We don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, as I keep saying, because we want facial recognition. Our opponents are going to be using it. If we don't use it for the right purpose, we could be at a loss. But can we use it in current state? If not, who is looking at the risk? Is it coming down from management? Luckily, this conference has the reach for the right kind of stakeholders in the organization, whether it's investors or the governance folks, the board folks, the risk officers, et cetera, on the private side. But going back to the solution is perhaps to think outside that ML box, right? Where if we have the right approach to risk, then we will be forced to look for the right answers. And biometrics is a risky proposition to begin with, but we do want to make sure that not only are we covering the conventional cybersecurity, we're also covering how it affects machine learning. And this is an example, again, not that IBM is the only one doing it. This is the one I thought looked coolest, so I have put that in my slide. One thing, I have a question for you also. You're probably saying, Pam, you have more questions for me than answers, but I'm trying to do both from the private side perspective, okay. Everalbum. Now, my biggest fear is, and I gave a talk on this on LinkedIn Live, a technologist's view of governance and the kind of regulations we need from a technology and a cybersecurity perspective, right? You know, my focus has been on how to build AI with trust, and just security is not enough. We need that four-legged stool I was talking about earlier. But I won't go into that. You know, people can look that up if they need to. But Everalbum, here, FTC being the only regulatory body which has some kind of teeth in the US right now. And Everalbum was a company that was using photographs for whatever purpose its album gives it away in the name. But they had to pretty much go back to the drawing board from what the FTC asked them to do when they found out that they were not doing what they were supposed to be doing. And that is just one small regulation. It's not saying that you're not doing the right thing. They just said you're not doing what you said you did, right? And you're not developing this responsibly. My biggest fear is if we don't have the right guardrails in place right now, we will have a bigger problem in terms of lost revenue, lost cycles, because everybody may not have the same common sense, even when it comes to ethics, right? And what is right for everybody and what is not right for everyone. That being said, I will bring up the DoD ethical principles and stop my screen sharing right now because this is from a different presentation. But my point being, we're already rolling these systems out, and how, what is the guidance that then we walk away with from here? Besides, you know, yes, we need to look at it holistically.
Right.
We need to look at it before you start having the conversation. And that's something we have done, right? As defining your processes, that before you even get the funding for a project, this is you need to bring in security teams. How prepared are they though? Because just bias, we know it is there. There's the codex on Wikipedia I was telling everyone about yesterday, which has kind of what you had represented, the code, the wheel, right? But it's not just the coders' ethics that will get into the system. If we have the right guidance, then we will be able to kind of influence that. So I'll stop right there because I do have, I want to make sure we go away with something tangible, you know.
And I think the hard thing is exactly that, is tangibility, because there's still some open questions that we have as a society. What do we value more, privacy or accessibility to different features, right? I mean, we like the fact that our technology on certain apps can make recommendations to us based on our perceived beliefs and desires, et cetera. But we have concern about, how much of that data, that information is available, and that's a societal decision, right? I mean, that's what we have to, and there's, yes, and that's not one that we're going to decide tomorrow. But related to that is really what's going to drive the change, right? Is going to be the market on the one hand, and the legal system on the other. And through the legal system, and even maybe before the laws in our country come together, I think Mark is right. It's going to be driven by insurance. To think about the adoption of autonomous vehicles, we can have a debate over whether we should use LiDAR or radar or computer vision, right? But we're not going to get to use them in a widespread manner until it's adopted and commonly by the insurance industry, that they find the right way, and by right, I mean one that they can agree upon, that assigns both the probabilities, the risks, who is liable in certain situations. I mean, that may end up driving the industry and the changes that we're looking for, while we wait for some kind of legal decision. And as I mentioned, with the European Union coming out with their AI guidance, right? It's in draft now. It's going to be coming out here very soon. If we're not a part of those conversations, and again, that's not my role, but if the U.S. as an entity, again, we have to sort of determine what's right for us and our business models in order to support our innovation, then we might be left sort of having to be between, a more of an authoritative, fully government-driven vision of that, like from the Chinese government, or more the EU. And so how then, if the US is interested in the tech markets in both Europe and China, then how are we going to navigate that? Most of the recommendations between the DIBS, the NSCAI, and others say that we need an overall policy. And I think, I'm not speaking for the corporate world, but if the corporate community could come together, as an industry, and say that we think that these are the key elements that need to have that need to be regulated, and regulated to this degree, so that it enables their innovation, doesn't stifle it, then but I think that is beginning to happen, but we can't wait for that, right? I mean, as you mentioned, Pamela, we're racing. We want to develop these things. I can't be held back, because I'm, especially in smaller companies, right, who are trying to get to market, their product, their system, and that's their main form of future income. And so I think having more guidance like that is going to be really important.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I know we've kept everyone a bit longer than we anticipated. This is something that we're really passionate about, and we're actually losing money to do this conference than making any money. So it's really something that we feel very, very passionate about, that we need to do. And I hope we are leveraging our skill set to spread the right words. Colonel, thank you so much. It's great to see you again. I don't know if you remember me. You had spoken at our inaugural event for Vice's Trusted AI Affiliate, and we always wanted to have you back, and this is the perfect platform. So
thank you so much for inviting me, Pamela. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for listening. Take care.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Okay. Bye.